Today's daf is daf Yud Daled, and we're up to V'im Tim Tzalomar. So we had one in Tim Tzalomar, which we covered yesterday, about a case of Nazirus Muetis. Nazirus Muetis is, as you recall from yesterday, is the phrase that's used to refer to a minimum Nazirus of Shloshim Yom. And he said, Hareini Nazir Liachar Esrim Yom, and Nazir Miachshav. So he has a double Nazirus. So what's going to happen is that after he'll count the Esrim Yom for the Nazirus of Achshav, then he'll immediately go into that Nazirus of Liachar Esrim Yom. So basically he has one Nazirus of Esrim Yom, then he starts another Nazirus, and then he's left over with 10 days of Nazirus to fulfill his malos for the first Nazirus that he started. And the Gemara says that lo solikle, just to review yesterday so we could segue into today's shir, that lo solikle, in other words, he doesn't want to be mafsik his Nazirus just to be mashlim with Asara Yomim. But in the case where he took a Nazirus of Mea Yom, and therefore he begins that Nazirus of Mea Yom with a full 20 days, but he still has a full 80 days, so then we can wedge the second Nazirus of Liachar Esrim Yom in between the first 20 days of the Nazirus of Me'achshav and the 80 days, which will be Mashlim later on. So the Gemara vacillates back and forth as to whether or not his intention when he was Makabel the Nazirus of Achshav was to fulfill the last 80 days as a very significant enterprise or entity of Kiyum Nazirus after he does the Shloshim Yom for Liachar Esrim. The imtim lomar. Now we're going to say the following: if Chayle, his Nazirus of 100 days is Chal now, and after 20 days he'll have to take a break to fulfill his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim Yom, and then he'll pick up the last 80 days after the Nazirus of Liachar Esrim Yom, those 30 days. So he'll have on day 50, since he began his Nazirus, his escapade, his journey, he will then start the last 80 days to complete the first 20 days. What's the din in Omar if he says, already knows the Liachar Esrim Yom? Fine. So we know that he was Makabel a minimum Nazirus Muetis of 30 days that'll begin in 20 days' time. But now he says, already Nazir Olam. I want to accept upon myself Nazirus for the entire balance of my life. He says, Hareini Nazir li Olam, which means that he's Noeg Nazirus Kol Yimei Chayav. And we said that in such a case, this was a Gemara that we did on Daf Daled, he's Mekel B'Teyar. In other words, when his hair becomes very heavy, he's allowed to cut his hair after 30 days, but he continues with, he doesn't cut all his hair off because he's continuous in his Nazirus during the entire course of his life. Although Tosfos is of the opinion that every 30 days when he does a Miktsas Giluach, he will bring his 3 korbanos, his 3 behemos, Chatas Leola, Ushlamim, Chatas Ola, Ushlamim. And in such a case, if he was Tameh during his Yemei Nazirus, he's going to bring Karban Tumah, which is a Keves Ben Shnas Liolam, Ushtei Torah Moshnei B'nei Yonah. Fine. Now, Mahu, what is the Gemara's vacillation at this point? Mi Chayli Aleh. Shall we say that his Nazirus Olam is Chal immediately, now? And then after 20 days, he'll have to take a break from his Nazirus Olam and count a 30-day Nazirus Muetes for the Nazirus of Liachar Esrim. And he would have to be Megaleach after he completes his Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, But we had a machlokes back on Daf Hey, if a Nazir Olam is allowed to be Mekil Betar after 30 days or only after 12 months. According to Mandi Omar, who holds that he can be Mekil Betar to lighten the burden of his hair after 30 days, then in this case, he will begaleach at the end of the 30-day period that he counts for his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim, and that's what he's going to do. So again, he'll begin his Nazirus Olam, and after 20 days, he'll take a 30-day break in order to fulfill his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim, Nazirus Muetes, and then he goes back and he's going to finish that 30-day period of Liachar Esrim and conclude it with a Giluach. Again, that depends upon whether you have to wait 12 months in order to be Mekel B'tar, but let's assume, according to that Mandi Omer, that you could be Megaleach B'tar, Mekel B'tar, not Megaleach, but Mekel B'tar, after 30 days. So 30 days has passed, and he could be Mekel B'tar. Oh, the other side is that he doesn't want to break up his Nazirus in the middle. He's got a Nazirus Olam, and therefore, he would postpone his Nazirus Olam for 50 days. What do I mean by 50 days? He's got 20 days of Heter, where he's not a Nazir at all. He'll begin his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim, a Nazirus Muetes minimum of 30 days. He'll conclude that Nazirus Muetes with Giluach at the end of 30 days. So he's now 50 days later. And at that point, he begins his Nazirus Olam. So it means for the first 20 days, he's not a Nazir at all. But after 20 days, he'll begin his Nazirus of Shloshim. He'll be Megaleach and he'll bring his Karbanos. He'll complete that Nazirus, and then his Nazirus Olam will be Chal. And the Gemara again vacillates on this point. And basically, the suffix is regard to Nazir Olam. Shall we say that since his Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, or the Nazirus that we mentioned earlier of Me'ah Yom, those are very similar to each other. And it's not considered a hefsek if he picks up a Nazirus of Shloshim Yom in the middle of a Nazirus of 100 days, as we said before, that we're in the Yom Tov Tzalomer now. However, in the case of Nazirus Olam, the Gemara vacillates that perhaps if in the middle of his Nazirus Olam, he's going to be Noeg a Nazirus Stam, that's a whole different entity of Nazirus, and that creates a hefsek. The Gemara goes on to build another suffix on top of this one. Imtim Tzalomar Hacha. We're going to say that Nazirus Olam is a whole different, now we're going to say that Nazirus Olam is there's a kula in Nazirus Olam, as opposed to, let's say, Nazir Shimshon, for example. That Hacha, he was makabel on himself Nazirus Olam, and you know what? He doesn't mind beginning his Nazirus Olam, taking a hefsek, taking a break for the Nazirus Muetes, the Shloshim Yom, for his Liachar Esrim. And why is he so laid back about Nazirus Olam? Became into Efshal Litshule, that Nazirus Olam is radically different than Nazirus Shimshon in the fact that Nazirus Olam lends itself to She'ela. He could go to a Chacham, he could be shol on his Nazirus that he accepted. Now, he could do this after 20 days. So in other words, when he's about to begin his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim, at that point he could say, you know what? I'm finished with this Nazir Olam business. I want out. I don't want to have to pick it up again 30 days later, which is day 50, after I complete my Nazir Stam. You know what? Nazir Stam is enough for me. So if he decides that he doesn't want to take this break, there's no loss, really, no terrible catastrophic loss over here, because he can always be shoel on Nazirus Olam when he starts his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim of Shloshim Yom. And therefore, the Gemara says, Chayla, the Nazirus Olam will be Chal immediately now. And you know what? If it really disturbs him and irritates him that he's taking a hefsek in the middle of Nazirus Olam in order to observe the Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, you know what? He'll go to a Chacham and he'll be shoel on his Nazirus, which will mean that according to this side in the Gemara, fine. You know what? He'll be Mekayim 20 days worth of Nazirus Olam. He'll terminate his Nazirus Olam by being shoel with a Chacham, and a Chacham is Oker Saned L'Mafrei. And then he'll start his Shloshim Yom, and that's it. Ge'endik, he's finished. Okay, fine. So that's the case which had before, that he was Makabel on himself Nazirus Olam, and now the Gemara is saying in Timtzalomar, he will observe his Nazirus Olam immediately and begin. But what about the following case? Amar, he declares, Haredi Nazir Shimshon Liachar Esrim Yom. Now, his first Kabbalah's Nazirus was Shimshon, but Liachar Esrim. Then he continues, Umei Achshav Nazir Stam. And now, today, I want to begin a Nazirus of 30 days. Mao. The Gemara says, here's the suffix. Hacha, in this case, when he was Makabel on himself, Nazir Shimshon, and we mentioned earlier that Nazir Shimshon is unique in contrast to his Nazir Olam in two ways. A Nazir Shimshon cannot be shoel on his Nazirus, whereas a Nazir Olam can. And B, a Nazir Shimshon is allowed to be Mitami Lemesim, whereas a Nazir Olam is not. Oh, let's add a third. And C, a Nazir Olam is allowed to be Mekil Betaro, whereas a Nazir Shimshon cannot. So Hacha, that he began with the Kabbalah's Nazirus of Shimshon, that was his initial Kabbalah, Lo Efshel Echue, and there's no She'ela on Nazir Shimshon. We'll discuss why not in a minute. Here's the suffix, Michaila. Should he now be Noeg Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, and then start fulfilling his original first Kabbalah's Nazirus, which was Shimshon Liachar Esrim Yom. So 20 days into the Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, he will begin his Nazirus of Shimshon. Olo, or shall we say no, that his second Kabbalah's Nazirus, namely Nazirus Stam of Shloshim Yom, would not be Chal, because he doesn't want to be Makabel on himself a Nazirus that will force him into an interruption, into a hefsek, but rather for the first 20 days, he's not knowing Nazirus at all, and after 20 days, his Nazir Shimshon will be Chal. And in this case, Lo Tachel Olav Nazir Stam. This is I would say, the most radical suggestion that we've had in the sugyas that we've been learning now, Daf Yud Gimel, Daf Yud Daled, that it's possible that two Kabbalah's Nazirus will be mutually exclusive, and only one of the two will be Chal. So that means the following, that his Nazir Shimshon will be Chal 20 days henceforth. He does not want to begin his second Kabbalah's Nazirus of Shloshim immediately, because then he'll have to take a break and fulfill his Nazir Shimshon. So in such a case, in the second side of the Gemara's vacillation, the Nazirus that he was Makabel, the second Kabbalah of Nazir Stam, will not be Chal at all. It'll never take effect. It'll never get off the ground. Why? Because he wants to fulfill his Nazir Shimshon continuously without a hefsek. His Nazir Shimshon, which is his original first Kabbalah, will be Chal in 20 days down the line. And there's no room for his Kabbalah's Nazir Stam. So it's Poreach Ba'avir. It just simply dissipates into thin air. First 20 days, he's not a Nazir at all. He begins Nazir Shimshon 20 days down the line, and his Kabbalah's Nazir Stam doesn't register at all. And why is this? Because Kevan she'ein efshar shanazirus shekibel tia shloshim yom elarak esrim yom, his Kabbalah's Nazir Stam could only extend for 20 days, because afterwards, immediately, he begins his Nazir Shimshon, which has no end. And therefore, since he's makpid, that he won't be able to be mashlim his Nazirus, therefore his Nazirus is not chal at all. That's the second tzad in the Gemara called Olo. What was the other tzad in the Gemara? That we should say that his Nazirus stam is chal, and after 20 days, he'll have to be mafsik his Nazirus, because now he has to implement his Kabbalah's Nazirus Shimshon. He'll continue being noeg his Nazirus stam another 10 days until he completes it. And during the first 10 days of Nazirus Shimshon, he will have all the full-fledged dinim of Nazirus for those 10 days, which means that he's not allowed to be metame l'meisen. And therefore, only after 10 days into his Nazirus Shimshon, when he's completed the 30-day period of his Nazirus Stam, only at that point will his Nazirus Shimshon kick in, and he will be allowed to be metame l'meisen. Again, you have to know about Tiglachas and Korbanos and so forth. Now, why is it that his Nazir Shimshon cannot be shoel on his Nazirus? So this is explained by Rashi in Masechet Makas Chav Beis of all places, and that is because Shimshon became a Nazir through a Malach, and therefore Chacham could not be matir the Nazirus that came through a Malach. Alternatively, Rashi offers a second, slightly different formulation in which Nazirus Shimshon is al yidei aviv, and therefore Shimshon himself, the Nazir, he cannot be matir the Nazirus that was taken upon him and imposed upon him by his father. And that's based on the principle that only the Noder could be matir his Neder, and the Noder here was the father. Now we have another suffix. Omar, he declares, Kim Moshe b'shiva bi'ado. My status should be like Moshe Rabbeinu on Shiva Ba'adar. Now, Shiva Ba'adar is both the yard side of Moshe Rabbeinu, and on the yard side of Moshe Rabbeinu, it was very common for people to take upon themselves Nazirus. But the 7th of Adar, as we know, is also the day, the anniversary of Moshe's birthday. And that would be more of a simcha. What is his intention? Does he want to be Makabel Nazirus? Because this is the yard side of Moshe Rabbeinu, and many Nazirim, because of the tsar of the yard side, would accept upon themselves Nazirus. This is not a Hasidic approach to yard side. Or shall we say, no, his kavanah was that he's going to be Makabel on himself a day of Simcha, because that 7th day of Adar is the birthday of Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's a holiday of sorts. I mean, this is very reminiscent of the Gadita in Megillah about Haman. You know, Haman was so thrilled that the poor fell on the 7th of Adar because he figures a very bad day for the Jews, but he didn't realize that the 7th of Adar is also the birthday of Moshe Rabbeinu, not just the Yom Ptiras Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what's the tzad to say that in this case the Nazirus will be chal? He says Hareini Kimoshe. That's not a lashon Nazirus. And we're going to have to say that this is chal midin yad yodos Nazirus kenazirus. Now, the Masifta quotes the Brisker Rav to explain a Rambam in the fourth parak of Nazirus. The Gemara has a diun. What would be the din if a person accepts upon himself a Nazirus of 1 day before his death? That was his lashon. Hareini Nazir Yom Echad Kodem Misasi. And he adds to his Kabbalah's Nazirus Ukmosha Haya Moshe B'Shiva V'Adar. So what's the suffix? Is this a chisaron because there's no such thing as Nazirus less than 30 days? And therefore his Kabbalah's Nazirus 1 day before his death is impossible. It's meaningless. Oh, she'ein bazeh chisaron v'tachal Nazirus. Maybe he could be Makabel Nazirus 1 day before his death, which probably means that it's really a Kabbalah of 30 days, just that his death terminates his Nazirus. So the Gemara, after it brings all these fakis of the sugya that we saw yesterday and today, regarding a person who cannot fulfill or complete his Nazirus, which he began Kedin, the Gemara has now a suffix, according to the Rambam's interpretation and his Girsa of Gemara. What about a person who's Makabel Nazirus 1 day before his death, which means that he won't be able to be mashlim his Nazirus, he'll only fulfill the Nazirus of 1 day. And he talks about the day of his death by comparing it to the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. The Minchas Chinuch writes that there's no chisaron of ein Nazirus l'pachos mishloshim yom. Fine. Gemara says pshot mia kad maisa. Let's go back to the original first suffix, which was brought in the Gemara on Daf Yud Gimel. That was the suffix of Rava. If a person declares Harei Nazir liachar esrim yom umeachshav mea yom, should he begin immediately counting and fulfilling his Nazirus of mea yom? Take a break, hafsaka after esrim yom, and then fulfill the Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, and then be Mashlim Shmonim Yom? Or should we say, that was Rava's suffix, he deliberated whether or not the first 20 days he's not a Nazir at all, then he counts 30 days in order to fulfill his Nazirus of Liachar Esrim. He's Megalech, and he brings his Karpanos, and then he begins his counting of Mea Yom. And now we're going to quote a Brisa that says, already Nazir Liachar Esrim Yom, Umeachshav Mea Yom, Mona Esrim. He begins to fulfill his first Nazirus. And then he counts 30 Nazirus, 30 days of Nazirus after the 20 days. And on day 50, he concludes his Nazirus of Shloshim Yom. V'akach Mona Shmonim Yom Kidei Lahashlim Nazirus Harishona. Just 1 second. Mona Esrim Yom. So if I understand this correctly, I'm going to need your help, Rabbi, with your commentaries, because there's nothing here in the Masifta. When he says Mona Esrim Yom, what he means is, I believe that he's not knowing Nazirus at all for 20 days, no Nazirus whatsoever. And the reason I say so is because it says afterwards, V'yachkach Mona Shmonim Yom. But what confuses me is Kidei Lahashlim. Oh yeah, I got it. I'm sorry. I apologize. I got mixed up with my numbers here. Right. So in other words, immediately he will begin his Nazirus, his second Kabbalah of Nazirus of Mea Yom. He'll fulfill 20 days of that Nazirus. Then he begins his Nazirus, the first Kabbalah of Liachar Esrim Yom, counts 30 days, finishes that Nazirus, and then he is mashlim the last 80 days of his original Nazirus. Now, getting back to our Mishnah, the Mishnah says that if he declares Haredi Nazirus K'shayir Li Ben Fin Nazir, he began fulfilling and counting his Nazir Shalo. Now his wife gives birth to a Ben. So the Mishnah says he drops his Nazirus Mishalo and he starts the Nazirus of Beno, completes that Nazirus, and then he goes back to be Mashlim his original Nazirus Shal Atzmo. Shalom. Okay, fine. So when he says already Nazir K'shayir Li Ben Fin Nazir, and he begins to fulfill and implement his own Nazirus, Nazir Shalom, now he has a son. As we said, I'm just repeating, he drops his Nazirus Shalom, not drops it, but takes a break. And now Nitma B'yamei Beno. So now it's a funny kind of situation here. Why? Because on the one hand, he's in the middle of the malos, the counting of the Nazirus of Atzmo, of Shalom. But on the other hand, he's fulfilling the Nazirus of Beno. Now the law is that a Nazir Shenitma is Soser Yemei Nazirus. All the numbers, all the days that he counted until this point are completely null and void. He's got to start a new Nazirus from the get-go. But in this case, his Tuma Hasoseres was during the days that he was counting and observing for the Nazirus of his Beno. He wasn't really fulfilling his Nazirus of Shalom because he took a break from Nazirus Shalom. Or should we say that Nazirus Shalom and the Nazirus of Beno now overlap, although again it's not counted in the Malos, but nevertheless, as far as the mitzvah and the kiyum of his Nazirus, it's one continuous Nazirus. And that would be the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, Omar Shesoser, that even though, let's say the son was born 20 days down the line, Lidugma. So even though he observed the 20 days of Nazir Shalom, before he began his Nazirus of Beno, Soser, if he sees Tuma, if he contracts Tuma during excuse me. He contracts Tuma during the fulfillment of the Nazirus of Beno, then even the 20 days of the Kiyum Nazirus of Shalom is completely nistar. Reish Lakish Omer, Eino Soser. He's not Soser his days of Nazirus, he's only Soser the days of Nazirus Beno. And he'll start again his Nazirus Beno again. And when he completes that, he'll be mashlim whatever he was chaser from the Nazirus Shal Atzmo, Shalom. And the Gemara explains the two shitos. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Soser, Rabbi Yochanan says that even his own Nazirus that he began is Nistar Chad Nazirus Arichtei. According to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding, the Nazirus of Beno is a continuation of his own Nazirus. Now, the Rosh explains that the reason what moves Rabbi Yochanan to take that position of Chad Nazirus Arichtei, Rabbi Yochanan's logic and Rabbi Yochanan's argument was based on the fact that Tiglachas, which always emerges with the termination of Nazirus, in this case, is only going to take place when he finishes both Nazirus. So let's say he started his Nazirus now of Shalom. He had 20 days of Nazir Shalom. His wife gives birth. he starts now a Nazirus of Shloshim. After he finishes that Shloshim, he needs 10 more days of Nazir Shalom, and only after that 10 days will he be Megaleh. So the Giluach is really on the siyum of both Nazirios. And therefore, even though now, when he became Tommy, he was counting the Nazirus of Bno, it's considered as if he's Omed Bi Emtza Nazir Shalom. And therefore, it's also all the Nazirus, which means he's going to need another 60 days of Nazirus. That's the Rosh. Now, the Rosh points out, but I think this is obvious, but we'll say it anyway, that if, let's say, his Tumah did not take place during the Nazirus of Beno, he completed his Nazirus Beno, and now he's observing the Nazirus Shalom to be Mashlim, let's say the last 10 days of Nazirus Shalom, and then he sees Tumah, then he'll only need to implement 30 days of Nazirus Shalom. He already fulfilled and completed his Nazirus Shel Beno. I think that's obvious. Reish Lakish Omar. Okay, now we're going to turn to Amud Beis.